Today I'm in Purton, a small village not far from Swindon, and it's a key stopping off point along the North Wessex Way. But for a small village, it's got a big history. So let's go and explore that in this video. Today, Purton is a village of just over 3,000 people lying to the northwest of Swindon. You'd be forgiven for driving through Purton and not realising that in its past it was a major settlement in North Wiltshire, situated about halfway along the North Wessex Way. If you're new to the North Wessex Way, the ancient route between Oxford and Bristol with its origins back in the Iron Age, then take a look at my other videos on the channel where I tell you about the history of this forgotten road. On John Ogilby's map of 1675, Purton is marked as being 32 miles from Oxford and 36 miles from Bristol. Ogilby also showed Purton as having a bypass, which would have allowed traffic to avoid climbing up the hill into the village and down the hill the other side. The original map is looking towards the west, so if we rotate it, you can see how the bypass runs across the fields to the north of the village. If you're familiar with Purton, this bypass route starts at Packhorse Corner on the road to Cricklade and ends at the bottom of Paven Hill on the road towards Malmesbury. From my research about the North Wessex Way, I've concluded that the route dates back to the Iron Age or even earlier. The evidence for this is the proximity of Iron Age hill forts all along the North Wessex Way route. One of these hill forts is at Purton. Ringsbury Camp is at the top of the hill to the southwest of the village, with a route running down the hill to join the North Wessex Way, at the point where the bypass road that Ogilby recorded meets the road to Malmesbury. This makes me think that the bypass route is actually the original Iron Age route round the north side of the hill that Purton sits on, with a short track up the hill directly to Ringsbury Camp. This is the red line I've overlaid on this map by Andrews and Drury from 1773, before the railway came through the village. The road up through the village possibly came after the Iron Age, but more on that later. Today, all that remains of the Iron Age route is a footpath that runs from the bottom of Paven Hill across to the railway. It's a lovely peaceful walk with a view south up the hill to Purton. At points the land is very boggy, with streams coming down off the hill. This would have made it a very difficult route if there had been some rain, and probably impassable in the winter. At the top of the hill, Ringsbury Camp is one of several hill forts in the area, and a reminder of the Iron Age activity in Purton. Visiting Ringsbury Camp involves a bit of a hike. It's about a mile from the nearest convenient parking place in the village. The centre of the camp is private land, but you can get a good view of the earthworks surrounding the camp from the footpath that runs round the side to the south. Once you are there, you will see the impressive embankment and ditch that surrounds the field in the centre of the camp. The word hill fort leads us to think that these had a military purpose, with the embankments and ditches being part of the defences of the site. Whilst they may have been used for that purpose on occasion during their history, other theories are emerging about why they were built. One interesting idea comes from Keith Alsop, a historian from Purton, who has a theory about climate change and agricultural changes in the Iron Age. In his research paper, he writes that at the start of the Iron Age, around 800 to 750 BC, it was colder and wetter than at any other time in the last 11,000 years, and the cold wet spell lasted until about 400 BC. This would have forced a switch from predominantly arable to predominantly pastoral agriculture, and led to the creation of early hill forts as a place to overwinter animals in a safe, secure way. Whilst we may never know the true reason why these were constructed, I still find them fascinating and very thought-provoking to visit. Ringsbury Camp was particularly peaceful on the day that my production assistant Dodger and I were there. Dodger, come here. So we've established that the original Iron Age route may have bypassed Swindon to the north. So when did the route up the hill and through Purton come into use? Well, the Iron Age came to an end in AD 43 with the Roman invasion, and I suspect it's during the Roman occupation that the route through the village was developed. At Packhorse Corner, the road takes a sharp left turn and heads straight south and up the hill into Purton. There it turns 90 degrees right and follows along the top of the hill before descending out towards the west down Paven Hill. The Romans did like straight roads and sharp corners. But that's not the end of the road story in Purton. Not content with having one bypass, Purton actually had two, and the second one runs around the village on the lower slopes of Paven Hill. It's most notable where it crosses Purton Common. In the past, this would have been open common land, but at some point the route across the common was enclosed. Today it's hard to see because of the overgrowth of brambles, but these photos from the 1980s show this long narrow route across the side of Pavenhill. What I find fascinating as you walk along this field are the stones embedded in the ground that run along the path for the whole length of this field. Was this some sort of paving? And if so, when were the stones placed there? It could have been in the last 100 years or the last 1000. And a final thought while we're here. Is this the origin of the name Pavenhill? A paved hill? Who knows? After the Roman occupation came to an end, Purton became a small settlement on the north side of the Kingdom of Wessex, a stopping off point along the North Wessex Way, which ran adjacent to the border between Wessex and Mercia. In AD 675, Oldhelm became the first abbot of Malmesbury Abbey, 11 miles to the west of Purton. The founding of Malmesbury Abbey had great significance for the future of Purton as a village, because in AD 688, King Caedwalla of the West Saxons granted 35 hides of land at Purton to the abbey. That doesn't sound much until you realise that this was over 4,000 acres, or 6 square miles. So what prompted this act of generosity? Caedwalla had been a king for 3 years, and his reign had been quite violent. In 688, he was wounded at a battle on the Isle of Wight. He knew he was dying and decided he wanted to travel to Rome to see the Pope. He set off for Rome and died 8 days after arriving there. Oldhelm, the abbot of Malmesbury, is also recorded as travelling to Rome at this time. Was the gift of Purton to Malmesbury Abbey by way of thanks or payment for Oldhelm travelling to Rome with King Caedwalla? Whatever the reason, Purton would be owned by the abbey for the next 860 years, with one exception. In the early 780s, Mercia was ruled by King Offa, best known for the dyke or defensive ditch he built along the western border of his kingdom with Wales. His army made various forays south of the River Thames at this time, capturing parts of Wessex. Purton was one of the settlements that he seized. For a number of years, Purton remained part of Mercia, until in 796 King Offa died, and the throne of Mercia passed to his son, King Egfrith. There was clearly some sort of cross-border diplomacy going on because Offa's daughter and the sister of Egfrith was married to the King of Wessex, King Beorhtric. Shortly after Egfrith took the throne of Mercia, an agreement was reached to hand Purton back to Malmesbury Abbey in exchange for 2,000 silver coins. This must have been an important piece of diplomacy for Wessex, because whoever controlled the high ground at Purton controlled the route across the north of the Kingdom of Wessex. And we know the agreement must have been reached soon after Egfrith became king, because his reign only lasted 141 days before he died in somewhat suspicious circumstances. So Purton was restored to the ownership of Malmesbury Abbey and remained as such until the dissolution of the abbey in 1539. You can get a sense of how important Purton was in the Middle Ages by looking at some of the population data from that time. The most famous is the Domesday Book, which was compiled in 1086. William the Conqueror wanted to find out his holdings and what dues were owed to him, so he sent out his agents across the country to survey each shire in England. There's a great online site where you can read every entry in the Domesday Book, and it shows Purton was one of the largest settlements in the area at that time, certainly bigger than Swindon, Wootton Bassett, Cricklade and Highworth. I'm not sure the data for Malmesbury is correct, though as an abbey it may not have counted as part of the king's holdings at the time. The population was likely to be much higher than the 14 that the Domesday Book lists. If we skip forward to 1377, the poll tax data also shows Purton being significantly larger than its neighbours. In 1376, King Edward III, also known as the Black Prince, died and was succeeded by his 10-month-old son, Richard II. Edward's brother, John of Gaunt, the Duke of Lancaster, took effective control of the country and, to fund the 100 Years' War with France, decided to levy a poll tax against each person over the age of 18 in the country. The records for that poll tax for Wiltshire surprisingly remain intact, and from that we know the population of each settlement. By this time, Purton was the second largest settlement in North Wiltshire after Malmesbury, indicating its significance as a village along the North Wessex Way. Bear in mind that these numbers were gathered only 25 years after the Black Death swept through the country in 1348, so they would have been considerably higher in the first half of the 1300s. The poll tax proved very unpopular and eventually led to the Peasants' Revolt in 1381. Another clue that Purton was a significant village in the Middle Ages can be seen when we take a look at the impressive church in the village. It was clearly built to make a statement to the people passing through the village. Purton Church is one of only 3 churches in the country that has both a spire and a west tower, and that came about because of the monks in Malmesbury. Malmesbury Abbey had owned Purton for hundreds of years, and in the late 1200s, William of Colerne, the abbot at the time, started a programme of works to rebuild Purton Church. The middle bit was built in the 1300s with the spire, and in the 1400s the west tower was added. But you can imagine the monks being inspired by Malmesbury Abbey itself as they came up with plans for Purton Church. Malmesbury had a spire taller than that of Salisbury Cathedral at 123 metres high. It also had a west tower. So they would have been very familiar with that form as they designed Purton Church. So today, if you want to see what Malmesbury Abbey would have looked like back in the Middle Ages, before the spire collapsed in 1500, then come to Purton Church and get a glimpse of what Malmesbury Abbey might have been like in the past. Indeed, if we compare the artist's impression of what Malmesbury Abbey would have looked like before the spire collapsed in a storm in 1500, and this photo of Purton Church today, you can see the remarkable resemblance between the two buildings. I like to think that the monks wanted pilgrims on the North Wessex Way to arrive in Purton and be impressed by the church. The monks would then say, if you think this is impressive, wait until you see the abbey. Up until 1276, the church at Purton wasn't owned by the abbey. In that year, William of Colerne, who was the abbot of Malmesbury Abbey at the time, acquired the church from the last rector, Master Beamon de Wiltshire, who resigned in exchange for an annual pension for life. The abbot then set about developing the church and the manor with a programme of works that added walls and buildings. The church grew and thrived under the guidance of the abbey, but by the start of the 1500s, things were in decline. In 1515, the manor was rented out to Richard and Margaret Pulley, along with the advocacy of the church, which allowed them to appoint the vicar and receive the tithes due to Purton Church. They had close ties with Malmesbury Abbey because in 1527 there was a great scandal after an outbreak of violence amongst the monks, and the subsequent investigation found the Pulleys were allowing the monks to stay overnight at the manor and turned a blind eye to their indiscretions and sexual misbehaviour. By 1535, Thomas Cromwell was looking closely at all the monasteries and abbeys in the realm, and Malmesbury was found to have severe financial difficulties. The abbot, Robert Frampton, was also found to be on extremely friendly terms with Margaret Pulley at Purton Manor, now a widow after the death of her husband Richard. On the 15th of December 1539, Malmesbury Abbey finally surrendered to the Crown, and the Abbey's long ownership of Purton came to an end. A quick word of thanks to Tony McAlevey, a historian in Malmesbury who's written this wonderful book about the history of Malmesbury Abbey, which has been so helpful as I tell the story of Purton. Around the time of the dissolution of the monastery, there was a royal visitor to Purton. King Henry VIII came to the Braden Forest, the royal hunting forest that is partly in the western end of the parish of Purton. I often used to wonder why there was a royal hunting forest seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Now we know that the North Wessex Way ran through the south side of the forest, and it would have been easy for Henry to get a boat down to Oxford and then ride along the road to the forest. On this occasion he went to Malmesbury after the hunt and demanded that William Stump provide his party with food. Stump was the businessman who bought the abbey after it had been dissolved and had to tell his servants their food for that evening was being given to the king instead. For the next century, Purton was relatively quiet until the village found itself caught up in the Civil War in 1642. King Charles had lost London to Parliament and he set himself up in Oxford, but he needed access to a port, and so the road to Bristol became a much fought over route. Malmesbury changed hands 4 times in 1643 and eventually the royal forces captured Bristol in late July. Purton folk would have seen messengers flying up and down the road between Oxford and Bristol, carrying dispatches back to the king. Charles decided he wanted to visit this newly captured port and set out on the 1st of August 1643 to travel to Bristol. He would have passed through Purton late in the afternoon on his way to stay the night in Malmesbury. We know this because before he set out, he wrote a letter to his nephew, Prince Rupert, asking him to send troops to guard him on his journey. You can see the original letter in the Athelstan Museum in Malmesbury Town Hall. Purton had another connection to this journey. At the time, the King's communications chief was a man called Edward Hyde. He owned College Farm in Purton, and it's recorded that he and some colleagues stopped in Purton for dinner as they travelled with the King from Oxford to Bristol. Edward Hyde went on to become the Earl of Clarendon and wrote one of the definitive histories of the Civil War. Purton has a wonderful museum based in the Institute building. It's open every Saturday morning from spring till autumn, and the staff there, in particular Lucy Lewis, have been incredibly helpful as I've researched Purton's role in the history of the North Wessex Way. So a big thank you to them. They uncovered the records of another historical figure who passed through Purton. On June the 3rd, 1740, John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, travelled from Malmesbury to Oxford along the North Wessex Way. In his diaries, John Wesley recorded that at 5 a.m. he got dressed on business, had tea and conversed. At 6:45 he set out from Malmesbury with a Mr. Cantor and conversed. He got to Purton at 8:45, ate and conversed, and set out at 9:45 and conversed. So you get an idea that he liked talking whilst he was riding. He got to Highworth at 11:15, had more tea, set off at 12:15 and arrived in Oxford at 5 p.m. So he'd been on the road for 8 hours and 15 minutes at an average of about 5 miles an hour. So it would have been a mix of walking and trotting on horseback. However, 15 years after John Wesley travelled from Malmesbury to Oxford, something happened which would change the fortunes of Purton forever. In 1755, an Act of Parliament was passed that created the Farringdon to Acton Turville Turnpike Road. The turnpikes were the first time the country had tried to do something about the state of the roads, and the turnpike trusts were set up to maintain the roads and charge people for using them. This is the actual Act of Parliament that I've got from the Houses of Parliament. And it says it's an act for repairing and widening the road from the town of Farringdon in the county of Berkshire to the town of Cricklade, and then hence to the town of Malmesbury in the county of Wiltshire, and the road from thence to join the turnpike road at Acton Turville in the county of Gloucester. This meant that the traditional route was diverted at Blunsdon, and instead of going through Purton, it went north up the old Roman road to Cricklade, and then across country to Malmesbury, along what is now the B4040. This had a big impact on Purton because the traffic the village had enjoyed for thousands of years, which had sustained the business life of the village, started to dry up. I was curious to understand why this diversion took place and found the answer hidden in the Act of Parliament that created the turnpike. The Act lists the trustees of the turnpike. These were the landowners and important people from along the route who would be responsible for setting up the road, maintaining it and running the toll houses. And they would benefit financially from having a good road running through their town. Two names jump out at you when you look at this Act: Thomas Gore and William Rawlinson Earl. These gentlemen were the MPs for Cricklade. Yes, Cricklade was a rotten borough and had 2 MPs. So not only were they trustees and set to benefit financially, they also had the influence to get the Act through Parliament. Purton had no MP and so lost out. Whether this had an impact on relationships between the 2 neighbouring settlements isn't recorded, but I imagine it would have caused a degree of anger and frustration in Purton, as they saw the traffic starting to take the better, though longer, route via Cricklade. Evidence of the turnpikes can still be seen in Purton at the toll house on Station Road, just opposite Collins Lane. This was from a later turnpike that ran from Cricklade to Wootton Bassett that was formed in 1791. But you can see the tolls that were charged for the various types of transport. Traffic on the North Wessex Way through Purton didn't die out overnight. The route was still used by drovers up until the middle of the 1800s. As they were driving cows and sheep, they would have wanted a more direct route that would have avoided the turnpikes that would have meant them paying a toll. The evidence for this is 2 drovers' pubs that were on the northerly route past Purton: the Roebuck pub and the Packhorse Inn, that traded until about the 1860s before closing down. Nothing can be seen of the Roebuck today, just the corner of a field with no sign of past habitation. But until the 1940s, maps were showing that there was a Roebuck cottage on this site. The Packhorse Inn is now a collection of private houses, some of which would have been small lodging houses for the drovers as they stopped overnight. The railway came to Purton in 1841, and this proved the final blow for the North Wessex Way. There were much faster and easier ways to travel from Oxford to Bristol. And with the growth of Swindon around the railway works, this was the end of Purton as a significant settlement in North Wiltshire, and it became more of a dormitory village for the workers at the railway works in Swindon. This is possibly the origin of the saying, "Do you come from Purton?" when somebody leaves a door open. Workers from Purton on their way to Swindon apparently used to hold the door of the train open to prevent it leaving the station, so that their friends who were late could catch the train. And so the North Wessex Way fell out of use, and today as you travel west from Purton to Malmesbury, it remains as just a single track road through the lovely countryside of North Wiltshire. Perhaps if the dodgy MPs of Cricklade hadn't got their way in 1755, this would now be an A road or a B road. And Purton's role in the North Wessex Way has also been forgotten. You can find reference to it being the old coaching road through Purton, but that hides the rich and interesting history of the village that had a place on a strategic cross-country route for thousands of years. So that's the history of Purton and how it relates to the North Wessex Way. If you'd like to learn more about the North Wessex Way, then find one of my previous videos which covers the whole history of the road. You can also visit www.northwessexway.co.uk, where there are more stories that you can read. And if you like this video, please click the subscribe button and follow me for future videos to come. So thank you very much for your time, and see you again soon.